We're going to start our last session with the third installment of the video. Hi, Tom, glad you're here. Listening to our Practitioner Council members and our national leaders. And before we get to that, I just want to take this moment to ask you all to reflect on the amazing logistics that we've had throughout this education summit at Hoover. That is the work of dozens and dozens of hours of many people's time. And I want to take a moment to recognize the fabulous work of the events team, of the communications and marketing team, of the Hoover Fellows support team, and my own team, who have put up with me trying to get an idea and a vision out of my head and into reality, which has been a real struggle for probably all of us. So let's give them a hand of applause. Thank you. They've been terrific. All right, so can we cue, please, the third video installment?
If we have been successful in creating dramatic change in public education, 10 years from now, what will be different? If we're successful in making the right kinds of investments, all children will have high-quality schools with the resources needed for learning. They will have a diverse and stable educator workforce who know how to support a learning process needed to achieve deep understanding of content and the ability to learn independently.
I want to see the profession of teaching dramatically change. New teachers would now have gone through a difficult preparation program with a residency component and with a demonstration of essential skills that I've learned. They would work in a school where there's time to collaborate and there's time to spend communicating with parents.
Public education will also be different because all students and families across the country will have full and unimpeded agency in accessing a wide array of excellent, innovative, and equitable educational opportunities that match their aspirations, interests, and needs.
A lot of options, a lot of student agency, a lot of community and family engagement, a lot of different learning opportunities, a lot of different curricular resources. The way kids are organized for instruction is different. We've gotten rid of the Carnegie unit. We've done some really fundamental changes.
A diverse and stable group of educators who know how to support a learning process that's needed to achieve deep understanding of content, as well as the ability to learn independently, because our kids are going to encounter knowledge that hasn't been discovered yet, using technologies that haven't been invented yet, solving major problems that we have not been able to solve.
I would also like to see civic literacy valued as a part of the K-12 public education system. If we expect for citizens to understand the governance structure that governs them, civic literacy and engagement is a vital component of their education, of their knowledge building, and their skills ability.
If we're successful in transforming education, fundamentally the incentives in our system will have changed. We'll be funding not just time and seat or average daily attendance, but actual learning progress and gains.
With the mastery of education, I believe that you will find more success and more students hit proficiency benchmarks and thereby having more success in opportunities post-secondary and beyond.
I think we should be focused on consistent and hopefully accelerating progress, building on our successes and addressing our weaknesses, especially in communities that have been struggling for decades and were set back even further by COVID.
We will have abandoned group identity as the most salient characteristic when reporting and evaluating student outcomes. We will have recognized that there are far more powerful individual factors that drive student achievement. Factors like hours spent studying, attendance, having access to a school of choice, growing up in a stable married two-parent household.
I often think it is time to shift K-12 education from an age-graded structure to a competency-based approach. That would be a dramatic change, especially with parental and public expectations of what schools look like and how students experience it.
The reality is, we know that there is a strong correlation between education and crime rates, between education and healthy communities. So when we are successful, 10 years from now, I think we will see healthier communities, and we're all committed to making that happen.
What will be different is that most parents will have a lot more choices among distinctive schools for their children to attend. I suspect many of them will have access to education savings accounts, so-called ESAs, where the state deposits a portion of the money that they would spend on the child in traditional public schools into a savings account controlled by parents that they can use to purchase a variety of education services.
For example, when parents use public funds to send their children to their school of choice, the school must respond to their satisfaction or risk losing funds. Additionally, when parents commit to choosing a school or provider, they often own their decision and are more likely to be positively engaged in their child's success.
By expanding school choice, we can ensure all kids have access to a quality public education, and our nation will be better for it.
All children will have agency over their education. They will view their schools and education as preparing them for life.
The achievement gap will have been closed, and every child will have an equal chance at reaching the American dream.
That would then allow them to get jobs that are both meaningful to society and have great earning potential for themselves.
As a result, we will see a substantially reduced income gap between those going to four-year colleges and the high number of students now graduating with professional credentials from post-secondary training.
We'll have higher literacy rates. We will have higher health indicators. We will have greater economic development, greater success of our students.
We'll have more 26-year-olds with AAs, BAs, and meaningful certifications earning family-sustaining incomes. In short, more young adults are doing what they love and earning what they need and making an enormous contribution to their communities.
What I would expect is the competencies of the American graduates from American public high schools would go up. Competencies across the board for reading, math, science. These are critical. But I would also like to see more attention paid to citizenship, because not only do we need a productive workforce, we also need an active, engaged, and informed citizenry.
The United States, 10 years from now, will continue to lead the world in innovation, creativity, and problem solving, with the proof of our continued leadership evident with the innovation of U.S. companies and U.S. workers. Our companies and workers will be the most admired and most sought after in the world because of their creativity, expertise, and performance.
We will have a much happier, productive, wealthier economy and society that's going to be creating absolutely new ideas and new innovations that, of course, we can't even imagine today for the future and for our future generations to come.
So this is where I get to tell you about all the nervous Nelly emails that I got from all of the actors that you saw during the time of production. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for stepping up. I think the end product is absolutely fantastic, and you should look forward to large numbers of people seeing this on our website when we post it later this month. It's my pleasure now to invite the final panel and moderator to the stage. And while they get into their seats, I'm going to introduce our moderator, and he in turn will introduce the panelists and lead the conversation today. We are deeply honored to have Dan Schwartz as our moderator today. He is the James Quillen Dean and Nomellini and Olivier Professor of Education Technology at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. He leads Stanford's Transforming Learning Accelerator, which is a major university initiative leveraging the revolution in brain and learning sciences, data and technology, to bring about more effective and equitable learning solutions. He's an expert in human learning and educational technology. He oversees a lab that creates pedagogy, technology, and assessments that prepare students to continue learning and adapting through their lifetimes. He has taught math in rural Kenya, English in South Central Los Angeles, and multiple subjects in Keltag, Alaska. Seems like this guy's running a lot. We'll have to ask him about that. As co-host of the award-winning Stanford podcast and Sirius XM radio show, Schools In, Dan discusses current topics in teaching and learning with the aim of helping educators and parents understand and use the latest research. Finally, he's the author of the ABCs of How We Learn, 26 scientifically proven approaches, how they work, and when to use them. Please help me in welcoming Dan Schwartz. I forgot the most important thing, his guilty COVID pleasure. He decamped, much like college students and young adults everywhere. He moved out, and just today is closing escrow on a new place, but he has been a peripatetic wanderer for months. He can tell you about that.
No, I can't tell you about that, but thank you for the opportunity. But yes, my cell phone has maybe 200 texts right now that I'm probably supposed to respond to as we're closing escrow. So thank you, Maggie. And I want to thank Condoleezza Rice for inviting me to serve as the moderator for the closing panel. So my assignment this afternoon is to guide a conversation about the future of education with some of the leading thinkers in education policy. And so this discussion, in my opinion, comes at a revolutionary moment for education. And surprisingly, I'm not thinking of the pandemic, though I do think the pandemic helped people recognize just how much schools, when they're open, do to ameliorate inequality. And if anybody's tweeting, let me be clear, I am not saying schools should have stayed open. I'm in no position to have an opinion one way or another. What I'm saying is that schools do a lot for equity, and we saw that, and I hope they can do even more. So what revolution am I thinking about? I am thinking about the copious influx of data and new analytic techniques. So education has always been an incredibly data-thin field. We get grades, we get occasional standardized tests, we get enrollment, we get attendance. These are incredibly coarse and partial measures of what affects learning and what we hope education should achieve. And I think this is changing, right? So there are impressive data sets that aren't just joining already existing data sets, but new ones that are emerging that capture, say, moment-to-moment behaviors across hundreds of thousands of people. Our abilities to analyze data are also exploding. For instance, using AI techniques, we can have a video camera in the corner of the classroom, and it can automatically identify the emotions of all the students in the class. Personally, I've developed a 10-minute game among many of these small games that quietly evaluates whether students use feedback. And it predicts nearly 15% of learning across math, science, and literacy, even though the game has nothing to do with any of these. So whether you respond to feedback is very important. So the big question is whether we can use all this data and new analytic techniques as evidence to improve research that can inform policy. So on today's panel, we have some of the leading thinkers who rely on data and not just ideology to address policy. And I'm hoping they can help us all understand how data can address enduring questions that have animated educational policy for years. So what I'd like to do now is introduce our panel. Evidently, we're revealing something about our guilty COVID pleasures. And so I will give you a chance to do that. I will move on to the next panelist, and then I'll ask a question that's relevant to policy. Okay. So let me begin. This closing session, hopefully, will be an invigorating end to a superb summit. So first is Chester Checker Finn Jr. He's a distinguished senior fellow and president emeritus at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he chaired Hoover's Correct Task Force on K-12 education. He's a former member of the Maryland State Board of Education. He was also a professor at Vanderbilt University when I was junior faculty there. I never heard him, but I did hear a lot of tales. So Checker is a scholar, he's an educator, he's a public servant who's been at the forefront of the national education debate for over 35 years. He's 20 books, 400 articles. Based on the data, I have concluded that Chester Finn does not sleep. So what was your guilty COVID pleasure?
Taking naps. Actually, we renovated our kitchen.
Very good, very good. Next, I'd like to introduce Carolyn Hoxby. Carolyn Hoxby is the Scott and Donya Bommer Professor of Economics at Stanford, the Director of the Economics of Education program at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a Senior Fellow at both the Hoover Institution and the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Among her recent projects, there's the study of adolescent education and economic growth. She's also known for her research on why low-income high achievers tend not to apply to selective schools, despite those schools' generous financial aid and resources. On a more personal note, in the Stanford Academic Senate, which is a meeting of all the representatives from all the departments, when Carolyn speaks, everybody listens, which is very rare. So what is your guilty pleasure?
Not having to wear high heels all the time during the pandemic.
It doesn't feel that guilty. It feels very good. Lastly, Paul Peterson. He's the Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government and the Director of the Program on Educational Policy and Governance at Harvard University. Professor Peterson is also a Senior Fellow at Harvard and a member of Hoover's Education Success Initiative, known as HESI. Professor Peterson is the author and co-author of numerous articles and books, including City Limits, School Politics Chicago Style, and The Price of Federalism. He's the senior editor of Education Next, a journal of opinion and research. So Paul, do you have a guilty pleasure you'd like to share?
Yes, my wife and I traveled to Ireland, to Jordan, and to Egypt in the face of State Department claims that we would be terrorized, would die, and would suffer all kinds of maladies.
How'd it go?
Wonderful.
Oh, good. It sounds like a great vacation. So thank you all three for being here. Here's my question to all of you. So what do you see on the horizon? How do you see the revolution in data availability and analytics playing out for your favorite policy topic, if you think it will do so at all? And if you have time, you only get 3 to 5 minutes here. What are the risks with new sources of data? So Checker, if I understand correctly, you've been a strong advocate of increased assessment. I think that may be true. So let's begin with you.
Well, I'm worried about holding on to the data that we've got. I mean, we want all kinds of data in education, and we, as you say, get all kinds of data, and we're going to get more. But the kind I care most about is data on whether kids are learning anything, achievement data. And an inadequate but crucial source of that data are test results of all kinds, assessment results, if you prefer. And we need more of those. Just for example, we need to know a whole lot more about subjects besides reading and math, and we need to know a whole lot more about 12th graders. But we're having trouble holding on to the assessment data that we've got. There is this huge pushback against testing in all of its forms. Some of it comes from people who think other things are more important, social emotional learning. Some of it comes on, I would say, spurious equity grounds. Some of it comes on grounds that tests don't tell us anything really important and they discriminate besides. So states are rolling back their end of course exams. Colleges are rolling back their entrance exams. Parents are keeping their kids out of testing sessions. I think that just clinging to the achievement information that we've got is going to be a challenge in the years ahead. And the reason that's doubly frustrating is that we really do need more than we've been getting, not less. And I think this is the challenge ahead of us on this front right now.
Can I just follow? This is a question I've been wondering. So colleges are not using SAT, for a while. How are we going to know whether it's hurt admissions? Is there some other measure we can use, or college completion, to know whether we lost something by not using them?
Colleges are sorely bereft in achievement data today. We know very little about whether people are actually learning anything in college. We know that they're getting credentials from colleges. We know that they're getting degrees and diplomas. We've got very little evidence as to whether they've learned anything. Now, some of the professional schools, it's different. You have to take a bar exam or something when you come out to see if you've learned anything, at least to satisfy the state of Ohio or wherever. We are going to need better indicators of college outcomes, not just whether people have the paper credentials that come at the end of sitting still for 4 years and getting an automatic straight A's. I mean, I just don't think that's a very good metric of whether colleges are doing a better job or a worse job. What they're trying to do, as you well know, is change the composition of their entering classes. That may affect outcome graduation rates. But it also carries with it a real risk of, frankly, a cheapening of graduation in order to make the outcomes look good. And I'm worried about that too.
Very good. Carolyn, so how do you see the revolution in data availability? Is it going to make a difference?
I think it will. I think it will make a big difference. I agree with Checker that hanging on to the accountability data that we've had in the past, or outcomes data, is really crucial, because if you don't have any outcomes, you can't do very much of anything. But I'd be much more optimistic, because people like me, we now work with data that shows us every single teacher whom a student encounters, and exactly when they switch between different teachers, and exactly when teachers switch into different schools. And that has allowed us to identify, I think, very credibly, that teachers really matter, and that teachers differ from one another quite a bit. So that getting, Teacher Smith versus Teacher Jones can make a very big difference in a child's life. Not just on academic outcomes, but on disciplinary outcomes, on whether you go to college or not, all kinds of things like that. And in order to use all of the latest techniques that we have in statistics, you need to have those huge administrative data sets. And we really are working with them. In addition, we're able to link data now on students from K-12, where we've always had some data available, straight through college, which I think is really important, and then into your career. So anonymized tax data essentially is being used, and anonymized Social Security data is being used, and therefore we know whether someone's working, whether they're employed, what their earnings are, when they get married, all kinds of stuff like that. And that's really helpful, because those are outcomes that are affected by education too. Even health outcomes, all kinds of things. So there's a lot to be done.
So how big of a data set do you need? Like 10 million?
We basically want the whole population of students
in
a state. But I'll give you a concrete example. The state of North Carolina has excellent, excellent data. And you can even tie it into their crime data and so forth and so on, as well as their healthcare data. Florida also has quite amazing data. And as a result, those two states have more research on them to guide the policymakers than any other two states in the United States. And if I were a policymaker, I'd rather be sitting in North Carolina where someone could answer my question, or sitting in Florida where someone could answer my question, than sitting in a state that doesn't do any of this, where I just have to hope that I know better.
Let me invite you to Maryland, where we don't know anything about anything.
Can I follow up on the question about SAT and ACT? Sure. Okay, I'm going to say something that is going to be a little bit controversial. I mean, not maybe with this audience, but it certainly would be with some audiences.
I could be, if you want.
So the SAT and the ACT have in many ways been great equalizers, and people don't really understand that. Let's say that you are from an affluent family. Maybe you live in a really nice suburb, like where we are right now, and you go to a fancy high school, and they know exactly how the admissions process works, and they give you help with your essay and everything else. You do not need help getting into college. But the only way to display to a college, if you come from a no-name high school in the middle of nowhere, where nobody has all of this sophistication, is the SAT or the ACT. And it is those two tests that have allowed top universities, selective universities, to find students who are not just coming from the fancy feeder schools. So I think removing them is actually very harmful to disadvantaged students and to students who are just coming from high schools that are not sophisticated.
No, that resonates. I was a very bad college student. I was peripatetic, evidently. And, but I was very good at the GRE, and it's the only way I got into graduate school. So it was sort of another indicator that helped despite the miss of my college career. A little selfish, I know. Your turn. What do you think? You think new kinds of data are gonna make a difference?
Well, thank you for that question. And thank you all for staying to the very end. So I appreciate your loyalty to this particular summit and to the passion you all have. I really appreciate your passion for education. And in listening to all of the conversations during the course of the day, I have come to the conclusion, not surprisingly, that I have come to in the past, which is unless we give parents a central role in our educational system, we shall not be able to achieve what we all want to achieve. And the best way to do that is to give them choice. Now, I was of that point of view back in the 1990s, and I began working on school vouchers. And then I ended up in a courtroom where I was being cross-examined. And this attorney was very good, I have to admit. And I was really naive. And so I presented myself as this detached expert who didn't have any values or any commitments of any kind. And he had done his homework, and he had dug up the fact that I had said that the choice advocates were just Jedi fighters who were fighting against the Death Star. Well, that sort of finished me with the judge, right? I was done. My data were not going to persuade him. I lost badly. I've never been asked back into the courtroom by the attorneys for the plaintiffs for my side ever again. So, but you know, that is basically what it is. It's the Jedi fighters against the Death Star. The Death Star is out there. They don't need data. The Death Star has the money, they have the soldiers, they have the resources, they have the institutional structure to protect those interests, the interests of the adults that are working in the educational system. And there's very few resources that the Jedi fighters have. They're the folks who want to change the system, but they have very little leverage on it. One of the few things they can do is to study things and to produce objective data that meets the highest standards of the profession, that will actually show that if we can change this system, we can get better outcomes. And I see Patrick Wolf out there who has done so much to convince legislators that actually, if you can give people choice, you will get better outcomes. And in my own work, I have shown recently that the charter sector, though, wasn't all that great when it was in its early days, back in the early part of this century. In 2005, you couldn't see that a charter school was much better than any other school. But what we now know is that the charter schools are much better today than they were back then, and they have improved at a more rapid rate than the district schools, and especially for African Americans. That's the group where the most dramatic changes, those are truly dramatic changes, where you can see the effectiveness of giving a segment of the population an alternative to the school that we just, the Detroit school kind of arrangement that we've just heard described. So that's really, you can only do that with data. And anecdotes are very important, and testimony from parents are very important. But unless you can show that that's true at scale, you really don't have one of the crucial weapons you desperately need if you're going to be able to produce change. So what is the responsibility of the researcher? The responsibility of the researcher is to get the best quality data available, to use the best quality analytical tools that are available, and then to present the evidence and let the politicians, let the public commentators make use of that data. You're not going to persuade everybody. You're going to be more likely to persuade people who want to be persuaded than those who don't want to be persuaded. Research is never going to change anything by itself, but research is truly crucial for those who want to see a change in our educational system.
So Paul, I think all of us are committed to evidence. The question was, do you think there are new sources of evidence that will be an ally, or alternatively, if you'd like, are there risks with the data we collect?
Well, it's as Checker has just pointed out, there's a huge effort today to prevent us from having new data. So whether or not we're going to have new data is something to be seen. Now, maybe there's going to be data available out there, and investigators are going to be clever at coming up with new ways of getting data that we haven't had in the past. And the research community is constantly striving for finding new things, whether it's new data sets or new ways of analyzing data. So one should be optimistic that we will see changes, but exactly what that's going to be, how that's going to work out is much more difficult to specify. But I would be, like Caroline, I would be optimistic that we're going to be able to find things, though Checker's warnings are certainly things to take seriously.
Can we just add that there's some areas where research is needed in order to create the instruments that will give the data that we would like to have? Citizenship would be a very good example of this. Everybody, including a couple of people on the film, talked about wanting better citizens, better civic education. Other than simple tests of civic knowledge, we've got almost no indicators of the effectiveness of citizenship education or civics education. We don't know whether it works because we don't have those kinds of metrics in hand. People are also very concerned today about school culture and want data on it. But other than surveys of kids or teachers or occasionally parents, we don't have any source of knowledge about school culture. We need ways of getting that kind of data, which we don't have at present.
So I agree with this, that we're very good at getting data where there's a right and wrong answer. Like I can say, this student didn't remember, or they got this answer wrong. Things that are state dependent, like how you feel at the moment, how you feel in this culture, this seems to be a place where we need some advances to be able to address some of your questions. So Carolyn, you link all these data sources. Do people see privacy risks with this? And is there a way that you can put up enough protections that it'll make everybody relax?
I don't think there are privacy risks because of the way in which we have access to the data, which is not like it's sitting on my desk, okay? It's
a box on the side.
It's in these restricted access rooms, and there are lots and lots of security protocols. You can't use it outside the room, and it's all been anonymized. So I think that the security risks have, often these secure rooms are more secure than, the IRS would be or something like that.
With one of these data sets, I could re-identify someone, but the protection is that it's in a lockbox.
And you cannot take any data out of these rooms, right? All you can do is take out your sort of results and show them to the person at the door so that they know that your results do not contain the name of some other person. So
I've seen too many movies where they put in the pen drive and they grab the data and sprint out. No.
I have used a computer where I have to have my hands on the keyboard in order for the computer to work. Like it identifies my fingerprints.
And we understand that Carolyn does this, and a handful of economists do this. The 80,000 members of the American Educational Research Association don't do that.
Well, okay, but I have like 200.
Sorry, wait, hang on. You're saying that there is a risk to data because there's people who don't know how to protect it. Is that what you were saying?
I'm saying that the amount of effort that it takes to do what Carolyn does, which is to go and sit for days in a secure room belonging to the IRS or the Social Security Administration, not many people are willing and able to do that.
I see.
But it makes a big difference because, for instance, let me give you the example that I think is really important. We have learned so much about teachers by having these big data sets on teachers. And we don't know who the teachers are, but we do know, for instance, that if you are a teacher who's very good at teaching and you move into another school, all of the other teachers who are teaching in the same grade as you or around you become better teachers too. And I doubt it's because there's some sort of formal professional development program. It's probably just because everyone thinks, oh, she has better curricular materials. She gave me some tips on how to. That's a piece of knowledge that I think we need to know. That having teachers who are great teachers is not just about being the great teacher for their classroom, it's also about influencing other teachers. Or for instance, if we think about compensating teachers in a different way, which I think is probably one of the most promising things we could do in the future. I'm an economist, so I always go back to compensation. Teachers are compensated very poorly compared to what we calculate as their value added in society. Very poorly, like a tiny fraction. But unless you have data to show that, how could you possibly convince society to pay teachers differently than we're paying them now? And also, they shouldn't all be paid kind of the same amount in lockstep pay. But how would you know that if you didn't know which teachers were the better teachers? So I think the data actually enables policymakers to consider a whole bunch of different policies.
I like the finding on quality contagion, where you have someone who's good and makes everybody around them better. It's a good finding. Million data points?
Well, think about the size of the population of the United States. Okay. There are 4 million kids in each birth cohort, right. Okay? So if you're studying, for instance, all of the children in the United States, which you cannot do at this point, by the way, you would be studying 4 million kids in each birth cohort. There are 13 grades if you want to count kindergarten. Yeah. So it's a lot of data.
Yeah.
What makes it possible to do that is the enormous increase in computational power that's now available. I mean, this was totally impossible 25 years ago, but it's now, daily practice. And the large numbers also help to protect privacy. So, there's lots of possibilities if the data can be collected and if it's made available by governments to analysts. And the privacy issue, I think, has been used by governments to avoid getting data. But I don't think this is the central problem that this conference has been addressing. The central problem is that we have not been able to move the needle for so many kids, and the situation is graver today than ever before. What can we do about it? And what are the levers of change? And I think research can be a lever of change, but I think the most important thing we have to do is to put parents at the center of our educational system and give parents a choice of school. Or perhaps homeschooling. This is an area where we should, one of the topics that has not been explored enough at this conference is homeschooling. And we're seeing a doubling of the share of the population that is homeschooling their children. We just heard a very passionate presentation on why parents are demanding homeschooling, and we know very little about homeschooling. This is, I mean, where we really badly need data is on homeschoolers, because there's a lot of allegations out there that they are not learning anything, or other people are making claims that they're learning more than the kids who are going to most schools out there. What's the real truth of that? I mean, that's an area where we desperately need to have new data in the future. And it's not going to be easy to collect, because we're not going to have huge administrative data sets on homeschoolers, but it may be the most dynamic sector of our educational system today.
Homeschoolers don't like to fill out questionnaires. They don't like to answer government questions. And we also need to understand that a lot of what we think of as homeschooling these days are virtual schools, many of which do take the state assessments, and many of which don't produce very good results. I mean, Mackey's research is a key source on this. The virtual charter schools don't do as well as the brick and mortar charter schools. So that's a version of homeschooling, more or less, that hasn't been a triumph.
Do we know why?
Do we know why? Mackey does.
Okay. Well, you can ask Mackey at the bar. You can ask Mackey at the bar. You can ask Mackey at the bar in 20 minutes. Okay, Paul.
So virtual schooling was something that 20 years ago I thought was, absolutely the wave of the future. That it wasn't going to be great to begin with, but we would be constantly improving the technology, and we would be learning how to make fantastic courses available. And I believe we just heard somebody make a presentation earlier today, which expressed my view of it 20 years ago, that the best teachers can be teaching online. We can't get that kind of a teacher in every single classroom. So why aren't we moving to online learning? It sounds like it's terribly compelling, but we, as I think Condi mentioned the other night, we've now done that experiment. We found that learning online there's something about the teacher, as Caroline says, there's something about the teacher that really is important. There's a personal connection there that children absolutely need.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think there are actually, I think the data show that some children actually do very well in online settings. Some children actually don't like going to school. Like they're being bullied at school. They have a teacher who's really not very helpful, doesn't connect with them. And so some children do better, and we figure that out when they apply to go to college. We don't know all the way along they're doing homeschooling, we don't know what's happening, and then they apply to college and we kind of figure it out. But the vast majority of students need to connect with a teacher and need to be motivated by a teacher, and they need someone to see them. And so one of the things that I think we will learn in the aftermath of the pandemic is that it did work out for some students and it did not work out for probably the vast majority. But it's too early days to figure that out yet.
Yeah, so one of my colleagues sort of took recordings of homeschooling during the pandemic. It's not exactly homeschooling the way we think of it. And what she discovered was the parents' respect for the teachers went up, because they would try and teach reading to their kid, and it wasn't going so well, and the teacher would come in, and the teacher knew so many details, was able to motivate the child. It may be possible to have teachers virtually. We've sort of opened the portal for that.
And getting the mix right. I mean, this is not a Luddite argument against technology. This is an argument for getting the mix right between the human part and the individualized technology-assisted learning and teaching that can enrich a kid and make it a lot more effective for kids, for example, to move at their own speed.
I think that's one of the most important things that we can do with technology now, is when you're a teacher, you may have a classroom, I don't want to say what size, okay, but there will be some kids who are way behind others. And you can't teach to all of them at the same time. And sometimes it's hard to even make sure that the students who are ahead have opportunities for enrichment. And you're trying to diagnose, why is this student who's behind? And technology is really helpful for that, because if you sit them down in front of the proper type of software and computer, they can diagnose, okay, they never learned fractions. And so that's why they're struggling with all of the other stuff.
Yeah.
Or they're very deeply confused about something in reading or
And even in the assessment area, the adaptive testing option both makes assessment more efficient and more accurate, especially at the high end and the low end, because the standardized tests, as you know, are generally sort of pitched at the middle. So you don't get much data on the high end and the low end without the adaptive feature.
Yeah. So the place I look forward to on assessments is kind of the unusual things. For example, there was a teacher that told me, this child, you know, I've tried everything to help her learn math. And just because of my expertise, I just watched the child for a second, and I realized the child had dyscalculia, which is kind of the equivalent of dyslexia in the math domain. There's nothing out there to diagnose that right now.
And there really isn't enough research on how we can use technology to bring the family more to the center of the educational process. So there's a lot of new ideas that are floating around out there. We haven't really discussed them in detail at the conference, but they've been coming up repeatedly, whether or not they're neighborhood pods or whether they're hybrid homeschooling, where they go 2 days to school, 3 days at home, or vice versa, and partnerships between public schools and parents who are going to be more deeply engaged. There's all kinds of new innovative ideas. Micro schools have been talked about. So, but we need to try these out, but we need to find ways to study them so that we know whether or not they're effective. Because there could be some there's been new nostrums, you know, ideas that people throw out there, and everybody runs off in a particular direction thinking this is the wave of the future. But we never really put into place an assessment system that can tell us whether or not it's actually making a difference. So that's certainly one of the agendas that has to be in the research community as we go forward.
And the empowerment of parents that comes through better information about things, about schools, about teachers, about their own kid, is hugely important. And that needs to be more than test scores. About a school's average test score. That does not tell parents everything they want to know. So to have more transparent information about schools and their own kids' performance and the teachers their kids are being exposed to and so on, this is a huge need for information.
So I teach the introductory PhD statistics course, and I show this chart that shows stanines, T-scores, all these attempts to try and make what those scores mean transparent. I don't know that they
Parents are really good with T-scores.
Yeah, I bet. So this is a general question I have. The school choice and getting the parents to make the decisions is kind of the assumption there can be a rational market. And I'm not as convinced as other people that parents can perceive whether good learning's going on or not. And so who's going to decide?
Yeah, it's sort of like me and buying a car. You know, I really don't know much about cars. I mean, it's true, my dad ran a service station, and I did work at the service station, so I know a little bit about cars, but that was cars back then. Cars today are very, very different, and I don't really, you know, I don't hardly dare open the hood. So, but I do find out, I have ways of finding out which is the right car for me to buy. And the market does provide the consumer with information. People exchange ideas. There's actually a lot more potential today to identify which car is the best car for you at a given price than there ever has been before. And I think the same is true for education, or would be true for education if you had a real market for education. So it's not like, some people think that everybody has to know everything about anything if they're going to make the right decision. But no, you learn from your neighbors, and the informal networks tell you a lot. Of course, there's going to be a lot of mistakes made, but there's even worse mistakes made when bureaucrats decide everything.
You know, I think one of the things that I've been very struck by recently is that in many developing countries or mid-developed countries, they're actually being much more innovative about these things. They're doing large experiments where they introduce school choice, and then they introduce ways of informing parents. They are doing about the different schools, right? They have systems now where you will get a text message as a parent that says your child is absent from school today, or your child is truant at school today, or your child at the end of the week. The teacher can give an evaluation so that the parent is being updated. I don't know why it is that if they can communicate with parents who are often significantly less literate and technology enabled than the typical American parent, we can't do some of those same things. I think in a way we're stuck in our ways, and so it's harder for us to move. Whereas I see, well, there are states in India, in Brazil, in Chile, they're often doing things that are just much more innovative than we're doing. I think we can learn a lot by looking at other countries.
But for this marketplace of choice to yield the kind of quality that we want it to, and that Milton Friedman said it would eventually do, we need much more transparent information about the schools. I mean, you could learn a lot more about what's in a box of breakfast cereal or a can of soup than you can about a school that you might be sending your child to.
Love it. 3 grams of SEL.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
24
Yeah.
grams of math.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the parents have lots of data. My general experience with all my colleagues who try and make dashboards for parents is the parents don't want to look at it. I've seen recent evidence that given free options for tutoring, parents who come from lower economic status don't take advantage of it. And you can apply nudges, but they still don't take as much advantage. So is the consumer going to use this information if we get it to them so they can make these choices?
Well, I start with the basic idea that a parent is biologically organized in such a way as to care deeply about their child. You know, all you have to do is to watch the elephants in the forest like Checker likes to do, or you know, it's just the way animals are. They really care about their children. They make mistakes. They are not always the smartest decision maker out there. But it's really hard to believe that some government-paid employee cares about your child in the same way that you do. I just find that very difficult to believe.
But the question here is, can the government employee come up with a way of representing the information about the choices such that the parent could understand this and take advantage of it?
Well,
and be willing
we
to.
would like to have transparency.
Yeah.
The more information that's out there, the better decisions that we're going to get by the consumer.
Yeah.
Sitting in the fourth row here is the nation's foremost proponent of giving schools letter grades, so that you know whether your kid is going to an A school, a B school, or a C school. Educators hate this. And in fairness, it doesn't tell you all you'd like to know about a school, because it's usually based on test scores and it's not necessarily based on effectiveness of instruction.
So we're going to wrap up pretty quickly. I have to ask, just for my own knowledge. So as I understand it, California is about to pay 33% more per student in public school. If I understand policy correctly, policy is about coming up with who gets to decide. So who should decide how that 33% extra gets spent?
Well, I'm sure that what's actually going to happen is that it's going to be spent in the same way money has been spent in the past. And they're going to hire more people, that's for sure, because that's the biggest growth factor in education is more adults have been hired, even though the number of students is going to be declining as we go forward, as it has generally been. And we are going to be adding more supplemental services. We're going to not be changing the structure of compensation for teachers along the lines that Caroline has decided. The federal money that's coming on is actually going to retard the pace of change because it's going to allow for a reinforcement of past practice.
So Paul, I sort of wanted to end on an up note. So let me have a different question. There's going to be 33% more going into California schools. What study do you want to run?
What study do you want to run?
What study do you want to run, if you could, with all this money pouring in?
That's a really good question. This is a big bump in money, right? And one of the big questions in educational research for now decades, really, is does money matter? Is it money that matters, or is it other things about it? I mean, obviously, you can't run a school with no money. But answering that question, does money matter, has been very difficult to do in the past, because what you need is a big change. If it's just incremental every year, you're never going to figure out the answer. So I would love to think that Paul was wrong and that they were going to spend the money in a way that was different than in the past. But I agree with him that it's just going to be like the pie was this big, we're going to keep it exactly the same type of pie, and we're just going to make it bigger. I mean, that's realistic. I think that's bad, but it's realistic.
So your up note might be that the taxpayers of California will learn their lesson and will come up with a different way of financing public education in the future.
All right, people. You've been great, and our panel's been great. Let's thank them. Thank you, everyone. I'm not sure that was really an up note, but we'll let it go. Before I release you all to the reception that is waiting for you in the courtyard, just a couple of things. I don't know if you noticed that there was a bookstore behind the registration desk, but into your fabulous swag bags, which fold up so nicely to be little tote things you can throw in a suitcase. You might want to add a few of our HESI research volumes, authors here on the stage of Paul Peterson, Checker Finn, Eric Hanachek in the back, and many of our practitioner council members have contributed along the way. So I invite you to pick up some HESI reports on your way to our cocktail reception. I want to thank you all very much for coming to our inaugural Hoover Education Summit, which is now adjourned. Thank you, guys.